oops. I see a comment by Rudolf Gredel that says, have you seen my email? Which is a bit worrisome. Let me see. Last minute change. So Rudolf Gredel will be replacing Stefan Schnorr.
I'm just promoting him as panelist.
Yes. Hi, Rudolf. Good, I saw your message in the chat.
You have to bear with me. Really a last minute thing. I'm really sorry.
I'm very happy to have you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Speak again.
I cannot hear you, so I have to change my. I speak again. Hello, hello. If the audio connection is not good, I can connect with my try to connect otherwise with my phone.
We can hear you loud and clear.
I think we hear you.
Okay, thank you.
That's
Good.
fine.
Good, thank you.
I think we're 131, so we might be starting. We're closing to 100 attendees. Jennifer, what do you think?
I think it's about time that we do start, and I think we have all our panelists here, so we're good to go. Hopefully. Let me just do some quick logistics, and I will start. Good morning, good day. Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Chung. I am with my other MAG co-facilitators, Jutta Kroll and Lucien Castex, the co-facilitators of this main session. Welcome, everyone, really, to the Trust main session. Internet fragmentation, is the digital sovereignty the problem or the solution? We have an extremely enriching conversation and a wonderful set of speakers and panelists for you. Of course, we do also have our great moderator from the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, director of this network, Mr. Bertrand de la Chapelle. A little bit of housekeeping before. All attendees are really encouraged to use the chat for comments, and also please, if you have any questions for the panelists, please do use the question and answer pod. We do have this session split into 3 segments for you. The first one will be on digital sovereignty, data sovereignty, and the second will be on disinformation and fragmentation, and the third will be on internet fragmentation about the infrastructure. I would like to pass the mic on now to our esteemed moderator, Mr. Bertrand de la Chapelle.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to moderate. I'm excited also to see the list of attendees. We are at 124, and looking at the list, I see a lot of familiar faces there, and I'm extremely happy to welcome everyone. A few words of introduction. Words do matter. And there are some words that actually carry a strong emotional connection to specific communities or to high-level principles. This is the case of the term sovereignty. It not only connects with the pride of nations and citizens of nations to belong to an entity that is exercising its self-determination, but it is also the foundation of the international system, our current international system, through the concept of sovereign equality of states. Unfortunately, we also know that the term sovereignty can trigger other emotions, conflicts, power competition, and sometimes devastating wars. So this is a word that has an enormous weight. We're in a situation where the global and cross-border nature of the internet is actually challenging the notion of an architecture that is based on the separation of sovereignties. We now have to collaborate across borders because transnational is the new normal. And this collaboration needs to be among not only states, but also other actors, private entities, civil society actors, technical operators, academia, international organizations. And in a poll that we were conducting in the context of the global status report that the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network has published last year, 95% of the people who were polled said that they expect cross-border legal tensions to increase in the coming years. And more importantly, more than 80% of them considered that there is not enough cooperation internationally to address those issues. In this context, the expression digital sovereignty has begun trending recently. I will not make the list of the different actors that are using this expression, but it is in a certain way very controversial. And it is controversial, I believe, because we do not have a shared understanding of what is actually meant by that. As I said in the beginning, it is a word that has an enormous weight, an enormous power. And when we're using this expression, we need to be careful and understand exactly what each actor means. And this is the reason why this panel is actually starting with a question, or under the question, is digital sovereignty the solution of the problem? Of course, you can imagine that this session of 90 minutes is not intended to solve the problem in 90 minutes. But the goal, I think, is more to help everyone understand better the complexity of the issue, the different dimensions of the issue, and more importantly, the positions of the different actors and the consequences of a certain number of choices. Because we have a problem in common, which is very simple, which is how are the rules set, implemented, and enforced on the internet? And also, what are the respective roles of the different actors? What is the role of states? What is the role of companies? What is the role of civil society? As Jennifer mentioned, we will structure this in 3 buckets. One related to data sovereignty, the other one more about content moderation and fragmentation. And the third one on the interfacing between the policy and the technical layers regarding the internet. So we have 90 minutes, a lot to cover. We have a very nice group of panelists. And when I look at the list of participants and attendees, I know that there is an enormous wealth of knowledge in this community. And so instead of picking 1 or 2 questions that the time allows at the end of a long session, I strongly encourage you to use the chat and to post comments or pick on things that have been said by a particular panelist that attracted your attention, that you think is important. Please do it in a concept of mutual respect, because the goal is not to fight a battle here, but more to understand the perspective of others. And I will do my best when we do the reporting on this session to incorporate the comments from the chat in the report. And if you have a very specific question, please use, as Jennifer said, the Q&A button. And I will do my best to monitor this particular feed and insert the questions as the need arises in the session. So with that, we'll move to the actual substantive part, and I would like to kick this with 2 questions in the poll that I will ask the technical support to launch. One is very simple. It relates to the title of the session. Is it part of the problem or the solution? So please tick the boxes if you think it's part of the problem and the solution, part of the solution, or neither the problem nor the solution. And the second question is actually an introduction to the first segment. The meaning of data sovereignty is clear for all actors. Do you strongly disagree, neither agree or disagree, agree, or strongly agree? This is a way to, you have 1 or 2 minutes to fill this poll. And this is a way to take the temperature of the room and to understand where people stand on those issues and the degree of understanding that they have of the parts of the debate. So you have a couple of minutes more. I will leave it for maybe another minute. And I think it would be very interesting to see the results of this initial question, because this is a complex issue. And I'd like to understand the starting point. Does the technical, the people from the technical staff, can they tell me if we have a significant number of responses yet, or if and when we can maybe close the poll, not to take too much time?
We are just about to reach 70%. When we do that, I will finish. I will end the poll.
Excellent. So this is good. So I repeat, use the chat to even potentially introduce yourself. Do not hesitate to take the opportunity to pick in the list of attendees people you haven't seen in a while, that you would have met in Poland if we had all been together, and send a private message, because keeping the personal connections in those times of separation is particularly important. Okay, I understand we have 100.
I have just finished.
All right.
Should I share the results?
Could you please show the results?
Please, here you are.
So I think we have a pretty strong message, which is sort of what I anticipated, which is a majority of people consider that it's precisely part of the problem and part of the solution, and a distribution on both sides, which I think is a good basis for having a nuanced approach to this question. And the second, the second poll, if you can keep it just 1 second, is that the feeling that the meaning is clear for all actors is an overwhelming sense that it is not clear for all actors. So it is an encouragement to try to clear up this. With that, thank you very much for for presenting the results. I will move to the first part, which is basically a nice natural segue from the question about the clarity of the concept. So in the first segment regarding data sovereignty, there is clearly a tension between data sovereignty and free flow of data. And I will start with Rudolf Bridl from the Ministry of Economy and Energy in Germany with an intro question, which is, I understand that Germany is pushing both the notions of future of data and the notion of data sovereignty. In addition, you are in presidency, I mean, Germany is in presidency of the European Union, and the European Commission pushes the notion of digital sovereignty. I understand that Germany doesn't see data sovereignty as an exclusive concept. How do you see the way to reconcile those two objectives and navigating in a certain way this narrow corridor between the two objectives? Rudolf, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Bertrand, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody. I first of all wanted to congratulate you, Bertrand, and also my dear colleague and friend Jennifer, organizer of this session, for the high attendance. It's around 200. It's not as much, but nearly as much as yesterday at the opening session. And I think that shows us already how important this issue is. When we did the poll and when we were thinking about has it a clear concept or not, I was remembering when I was very young, the world was still divided into two blocks, and you had at both sides you had freedom fighters fighting for either the east or the west in another country, and these freedom fighters were always terrorists for the other side. So it is perhaps with the data sovereignty a little bit similar, because it really depends on your point of view and how you define it. If it is something worth defending, or if it is something that might perhaps even destroy the order of the internet. And that's actually the corridor in which we in Germany, and I think everybody in Europe and perhaps also beyond, is now navigating. We do definitely want to have in Europe and in Germany the ability to be a self-determined digital economic space or nation. So we want to, not only as a state, but businesses, SMEs, research institutions, the civil society, we all want to have the possibility to be our own masters when it comes to our data, when it comes to technology development, when it comes to new business models. And that is quite natural for, I think, everybody. But we are in Germany and in Europe in general, we are a free trading and free flow of data promoting area. So when we talk about sovereignty, we definitely do not want to talk about protectionism, not want to talk about even not about self-sufficiency or autarky. We want to avoid the creation of islands and silos between the great regions. So and how do we want to achieve this? In our view, it is important, if you have this aim that I just described, it is important to look in a mirror and say, okay, you want to have a capability, you want to be at the height of the discussion, of the research. So it's not by bringing up borders, it's not by making the others poor, it's not by destroying the network that exists, it's by getting better. So we in Europe, that's our aim. We want to get better than we already are. And that's when we look at our data strategy, for instance, we have human resources, capacity building within the European constituencies. We have all the aspects of research. We have the project of Gaia X, where we want to connect existing structures, build out of them a European cloud and especially a data area where we want to reach through cooperation, through working together, that we become better.
If I can pick on this, you mentioned Gaia X.
Please.
You mentioned Gaia X. Could you explain very briefly how it connects with the notion of data localization? Is it a commercial offering? Is it a meta framework? Is it a space for cooperation? I understand there will be a major event soon on Gaia X. Can you tell us very briefly what the concept is?
It's not really data localization, because it implicates companies from all over the world, not only from Europe. It is about leveraging the treasures, the data treasures that are available in Europe, but that are hidden treasures in research institutions, in state organizations, in SMEs, in larger companies. So the idea is to pool this data, so everybody gives something into this pool, and afterwards has the possibility to draw from this pool all the other data that are also in this pool. And so it is if you want to, there is one aspect of, I wouldn't call it localization, but it is an aspect or a regulatory aspect, because the Gaia X ecosystem should be according to the rules of the data protection laws, or the European laws in general, the antitrust laws, and so forth. So there is an aspect of, European regulatory ownership, but it is not meant to be exclusive. And what we want to launch now is this kind of a vehicle, this kind of central steering entity that allows us to start with this pooling exercise.
So if I understand correctly, and we will move to Paul Mitchell for the sake of time, but if I understand correctly, there is a dimension of sharing, a dimension of commons, and a regulatory dimension, which is a certain number of regimes that apply to the data that will be stored in infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The next person that I want to talk to is Paul Mitchell from Microsoft. And as many of you know, Microsoft was part of a major case regarding the location of data that was at the time stored in Ireland. And I want to ask you, Paul, the fundamental question: does the location, the physical location of data really matter? Should it really matter? And can it even be determined all the time? Floor is yours.
So the answer to the questions are maybe, possibly, and sometimes, I think. I think the reality around sovereignty and data, and if we think back to the Warrant case, which you're referring to, the reality is that in the digital universe, we have a situation where the most important asset can be shared just as easily as it can be not shared. It's not scarce in the economic terms. If I have a piece of data and you have the same piece of data, we can both use it at the same time. Whereas, if I have a physical object or a physical good like lumber, for example, I can have it, but you can't have it at the same time. I think that fundamentally changes the way that countries and actors like Microsoft need to think about what is actually happening in the economy being driven by data. The idea, think about sovereignty, reflecting the idea that something is subject to specific laws and regulations of a specific jurisdiction. And that was essentially the issue in our warrant case, where we were asked to disclose data that we had in a data center outside of the United States. And ultimately, that case was resolved, and it led to the creation of the Cloud Act in the United States, which defines effectively the opportunities and limits for and to the responsibilities of U.S. data holders relative to disclosure of data on that may be requested by law enforcement or for other reasons. I think, nevertheless, the whole point of this is that we're a new situation where the old rules of scarcity and control don't make sense anymore, and this has led to discussions and legal cases, etc. I think a big challenge for this universe is how we rationalize differing approaches. So we talked about the idea of sovereignty on the one hand, and the poll was interesting in terms of basically saying, I guess predictably, that it's part of the problem and part of the solution, because we have different interpretations of what sovereignty actually means in this context. I think it's probably a mistake to focus on the idea of sovereignty itself. And I would rather see us move the discussion to enabling social development and enabling economic development, because data can be a shared resource in a way that physical assets cannot be.
Sorry, just one question. I want to pick on two things that you said. One is the notion of scarcity. And I think this is an element that is not necessarily taken enough into account in the approach to the digital economy, where the sharing of data is a fundamental element, and the restrictions to the sharing of data are actually limiting the capacity to create value. But there's a second dimension which was embedded in the case that you were mentioning, which is the notion of the territoriality of sovereignty. And this is why I was asking whether the location of data should matter, or whether it is more a matter of who controls it, who can create value, etc. And can we?
Well, yeah, I mean, the practical reality for data is it doesn't matter where it actually is, as long as there's a connection to it, right? Microsoft has data centers all around the world. Google has data centers. Facebook and Amazon. All of the big cloud providers have data centers everywhere. It seems like, and it doesn't really matter where the data is, as long as it can be accessed. And so that does get into really complicated questions about how you manage the networks and who owns or operates, or what are the rules for operation of various segments of the networks that are all interconnected with each other, that then enable this sort of global sharing of data. But I think these are the things that really are create substantial differences in the way you manage the resource. If you think of data as a resource, you can extract value out of data, and the value of data gets more valuable when there's more of it, when you can actually do more correlations. If you think about what you can do with artificial intelligence and using AI training systems, the more data that you have, the better your end results can be over time. And this is fundamentally a different way of thinking than the old commodities-based thought. Now, in the early days, before we had cloud services, and before we were really thinking as expansively, I think, as the industry is now, we sort of mused over the concept of free trade zones for data. So the closest sort of analogy we had was, well, we've got free trade zones in certain ports, right, where ships can unload containers and they can be shunted around, and they're sort of in a protected zone. And we wondered at various times, what's the data equivalent of that? And we don't really have an equivalence, because that whole model still was based on the idea that things were scarce. And the only reason the data is scarce is if we make it artificially scarce.
I think it's a very important element. I think what you're highlighting is the difficulty of applying the existing mental frameworks that we had for goods to something that is structurally behaving differently, and the data is different. I have just a final quick question so that we can move on in the discussion. When we were doing the preparatory call, you mentioned something that I think is important for the people in the audience to know, because it is a sort of counter fragmentation, is the fact that Microsoft, if I understood correctly, does apply a level of privacy protection that is compatible or equivalent to the GDPR to all its users around the world. Is that the case?
Yeah, and that's actually very important. I mean, so moving the conversation from data as an asset to for the economy, to data as an extension of your person. The GDPR is at this point the world's most advanced privacy framework for citizens. And when that came into effect, Microsoft made the decision to apply the GDPR, our implementation of GDPR protections to everybody that's a Microsoft customer. It just makes sense. At the same time, Microsoft is also actively in the United States. We are pressing for federal legislation on privacy. We think it's a whole lot better to have a common privacy framework than to have 50 different ones from 50 different states, which is potentially the direction we otherwise would be going in the United States. But yes, actually, our view is protecting data privacy for individuals is supremely important worldwide.
I just wanted to highlight this because when we're talking about fragmentation, there are also trends that are going in the other direction of sort of harmonizing, and in that case, to a higher level of protection. Just as I mentioned in the Q&A, there is a comment by Michael Nexon in particular saying that sovereignty is not the only topic, or digital sovereignty is not the only topic that is fuzzy, and that a lot of those discussions are actually built on expressions that we do not agree on the meaning of. And there was a comment also on how do we unify our understanding of digital sovereignty and develop universal rules of the game for the internet governance and digital cooperation. I think what you were mentioning, Paul, is going in that direction, and sort of what are the rules for the cloud services that are available. I want to be very conscious of the time and move now to Atsuko Okuda from the International Telecommunications Union. Atsuko, you're based in Asia, and I know that it is sometimes difficult for an international organization to navigate the different perspectives of its own member states, and you cannot take sides. But I wanted to ask you, do you think that there is enough awareness in different regions, and particularly in Asia, on the different elements of this discussion? And also, do we take enough into account the perspective of smaller or less developed states, and particularly small islands?
Thank you for this excellent question. In fact, I believe that this people-centered approach, and perhaps I can also add trust elements are important ingredient for the discussion. And I also want to build on what Paul was saying regarding the importance of data sharing and the opportunities and empowerment that creates by doing so. In Asia and the Pacific, ITU covers 38 countries. That is 60% of the world population. And one of the key mandates that ITU has is to connect the rest of the half of the population. And a huge number of people reside in Asia and the Pacific, and to address the digital divide is a mandate. Through digital connectivity and capacity development, we are making progress. Now, when people get connected to the internet, what do? So a lot of people start using the social media, different platforms which are available. And at the same time, that opens up a lot of opportunities for e-commerce. So an increasing number of companies are getting involved and integrated into the global value chain. And by getting connected, that created an opportunity for education and health and employment, for example. So the internet and the access and the data which are being shared have been transforming the lives, socioeconomic, the realities in many of the countries in Asia and the Pacific, including the LDCs and CIS, which are least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small islands, developing states. However, I agree that this data sovereignty is an important issue, and establishing good norms and principles would be important so that these people who are coming to be connected for the first time in their lives know that their data are treated in a way that is transparent, and they know what happens to the data that they produce themselves. To come back to your question, because of that dynamics which is happening in Asia and the Pacific, people are starting to realize the importance of the data that they generate or they share. So within the country, there is an increasing awareness, but perhaps there is no broad-based discussion per se yet, but we are getting there. But that is also creating another complexity, because in Asia and the Pacific, not all countries, because of that, are aware and fully equipped to engage in the international discussion.
Sorry to interrupt you. When you say equipped, you mean equipped in the terms of the political understanding and participation? Also
as well as the technical understanding. And perhaps the understanding on the data protection policies, privacy policies, which they may or may not have in place. So with that, it is going to be a challenge to be fully engaging as of now, but we are assisting member countries to raise awareness on many of these critical points without compromising perhaps the economic and social opportunities that getting connected is creating. I just also want to add one more aspect of our work. I believe that fundamentally important in all of this discussion is the trust. And in order to create the trust and address the privacy, cybersecurity issues, we are also assisting member countries with child online protection and cybersecurity, so that there will be capacity and policy and expertise in our member countries to address the challenges that we are all facing in the data sphere. So I hope that
yeah, it's important, and one of the things that also is in the background is whether the notion of data localization is actually a necessity for development, or on the contrary, something that can only be achieved by very large countries that have the infrastructure and that have a certain number of already existing powerful positions, and whether actually in terms of development, data localization, is data localization something that helps small countries or small companies, or actually reinforces the positions of the higher powers. So I just wanted to mention that in this context. Thank you, Atsuko. I will now shift to another continent, which is Africa, with Alison Gilwald, and this is a question that is related to also the diversity of situations in Africa and the very diverse stages of development, both in infrastructure and policy capacity among the 50 countries that exist in Africa. I was wondering, as you mentioned during the prep call, it seems that data sovereignty is more a matter of control and ensuring the right protections and developing the value out of the data, rather than the key question of the location, right? You're muted.
Turned it on and turned it off again. Sorry about that. I just wanted to say, absolutely, you know, I think some of the data localization points that have been pointed around African governments wanting to, ensure that data is localized has been a little bit of a red herring, especially when the argument is made, well, African governments, many African countries, nations don't have the infrastructure and capacity to actually, run big data centers to big data warehouses, and particularly even beneficiate that data. But I don't think that's actually the point. I think there are two aspects to this. So one is that data localization is actually being used by governments that are actually concerned about controlling data, very often for political ends, less so than for economic ends, although I'll come to economic ends because I think there's a legitimate rationale for data localization, or at least data control for industrial policy, in order to develop economies and develop. But I think what we're seeing is a conflation of issues around sovereignty and indeed legitimacy, on which the normative national sovereign state and digital sovereignty are based on assumptions of legitimate sovereign states exercising their legitimacy in defending their citizens' rights, etc. And really, states whose legitimacy is actually challenged internally, who are trying to control data flows both in and out of the country in order to control their citizens and potentially breach their rights, etc. So I think one needs to look at those quite separately. Often they're conflated, and often all developing countries are put into the same box, and there's obviously enormous variations there. So I think putting the kind of political aside and looking at the issues around legitimate concerns about data, which has now become a very valuable asset. And so governments have a strategic obligation to think about how this can be optimized and maximized for their own development. And that's why I think it's always a little problematic that we speak about some of these really interlinked digital ecosystem issues in these kind of silos, either trade or development or political power and those kinds of issues of data protection and rights, etc. Because they're actually very interrelated. And it really goes to the point that Paul was making around data as a non-rivalrous good, but now also a very valuable non-rivalrous good, but that I should point out is not made artificially scarce by governments only, which is often the implication. It's developing countries that make it artificially scarce by wanting to localize. In fact, it's been made most artificially scarce by big monopoly platforms that control that data. And so these what effectively should be global public goods, data, internet, cybersecurity, these all have the potential to be global public goods, are now delivered by private entities who control those assets. And in the delivery of those, which have been enormously successful, and more people have information and access, data flows are greater than ever, But it doesn't mean that governments abdicate their obligations to their citizens to ensure that their citizens' data is protected, that that data can be optimized locally, that the kinds of concentrations of data that Paul has referred to actually allow companies like enormous first mover advantages, closing off the data to competitors, and those kinds of things shouldn't be dealt with at the national, regional level. And this really goes to the incredible need for countries to be able to cooperate globally, because these are issues that you can no longer address at the nation state level alone. You can't close down your borders, you can't do these things and hope to develop, to get digital opportunities in your country, etc. So it really goes to the need to find some supranational system that can allow for these data flows to move across borders in a way that are protected, that safeguard citizens, etc.
I think, Alison, the moment you mentioned the word supranational, it will trigger a lot of alarms among people. I think if we say transnational, it will be more precisely of the sovereign.
Saying bigger than the nation state. The sovereign nation state cannot deal with this on their own. But that is where the public goods are realized.
I know the sensitivity about the term supranational. Each of those remarks would deserve a whole continuation. I think it's important to mention the notion of the creation of value and the creation of social and economic value, because there is an opportunity in the sharing of the data also to create social value outside of the pure economic valuation. And the more barriers there are, the less it is possible to do that sort of value creation. Which actually is a transition. Briefly, I will ask maybe Alisa and Jun to be very concise, because we will come back to you a little bit later. But Alisa, you are the chair of the Internet Engineering Task Force, and I thought it was interesting to have your comments, because the fundamental idea behind the technical protocols is that they're oblivious to geography, and that the standard setting bodies have a preference for something you describe as things that are as generic as possible to allow the devices to connect seamlessly. How much of a burden is it for the technical layer to reintroduce some elements linked to geography? And also, what is the connection with the notion of resilience? Does data localization increase resilience, threaten resilience? How is this seen from the technical layer?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think you hit it right on the mark. That the way that the internet was designed was explicitly to encourage global interconnectivity and explicitly to be oblivious to national borders. That was one of the core goals from the outset. Was to get as many people, devices, and networks connected as possible on a global scale. And that continues to be the objective when we're designing and evolving the technologies at the core of the internet. So we continue to want to ensure that we can get as many new kinds of devices and kinds of networks connected, and that we don't tailor the way that we are designing these things to the requirements of any particular jurisdiction or the way that networks are administered in a particular country. It's very important to hold the fabric of the internet together. At the same time, the other goals that we are pursuing, I think when we look at what happens with data sovereignty, sort of outside the bounds of the design of the technology, what data sovereignty does is introduce constraints. So these goals that we're pursuing are things like improving the performance of the network, making everybody's user experience better, faster, more seamless, improving the security of the network. So increasing the extent to which we have confidentiality and integrity of the data that we share, making the networks easier to configure and manage. So introducing simplicity and automation into the way that we manage networks. These are the kinds of things that engineers in the industry, in the networking industry, are pushing forward on hard every single day. And when we then look at data sovereignty, it creates constraints around all of these things. So if you can only have endpoints in a certain location and you're trying to reduce your latency, now you have to factor in the fact that you're just going to have to connect to a faraway endpoint in order to have the data reside in the right place. Same thing with security. You're looking at how do I manage my encryption keying infrastructure if lots of new constraints are introduced around where we can hold the keys, or they have to be split keys, sharded keys, right? All of this introduces more complexity into a system which we are actively trying to simplify. So it's not to say that we changed the way that we design the network in order to accommodate new data sovereignty requirements. But these are things that are happening in the world that we can't ignore. And therefore, it adds another layer of complexity that we have to acknowledge and think about as networks actually get built and deployed in the real world.
Thank you very much, Alisa. I think there's an element that you mentioned in the prep call that is worth inserting here without belaboring on it, is the distinction between the capacity for different actors to replicate their data for their own optimization versus the obligation to replicate in certain places. And I think it's a mental distinction that we need to have in mind. And once again, as Alison was mentioning, the goal of this is not to have a one-sided version. There are, or as Rudolf was mentioning before, the concerns about protections, particularly on personal data, about the control, the capacity to extract value, to improve the accessibility to certain information, are absolutely very valid concepts that are somehow embedded in the notion of digital sovereignty. I think what Alisa is telling us is that the way we handle this is potentially imposing certain constraints, as she said, and we will come back to that on the last part regarding the technical infrastructure. I want to finish this round, which was a bit of a setting the scene in general, with John. John Murray is an internet pioneer and one of the initial people who set up the internet in Japan, and one of the first board members of ICANN. You see the current debates, and as Alisa was saying, it departs a little bit from the original vision of a global infrastructure. And during another session at the IGF, I understand that you emphasize something that is important, which is one of the priorities for governments should be to have their own frameworks in order at the national level in order to be able to interconnect with other frameworks internationally before trying to solve the problems on a technical basis. Did I understand correctly what you were mentioning?
Yes, as we all know that when we're developing the internet, then so what we kind of course intentionally and non-intentionally that developing the internet without the concept of the border, especially on the border by anything, but especially on the nation state, and that therefore we have established probably the first of the human being in the history, the truly global space. That was the internet, which is a very important thing. And then also the digital data, digital information is replicable. Therefore, if you lose the data, then you can still generating exactly the same data again, which is kind of located in anywhere. And also another aspect is that the encryption technology, which is basically the protecting the data. Therefore, the data location doesn't really the problem, and therefore, without the border and the nation state, and then the nature of digital information, that was a kind of a brand new, creating the brand new space on the cyberspace. And then so when the most of the different aspect of the nation state-based, government-based deployment of the global communication also existed. And then so the question was, so what's the difference between the kind of nation international space versus a global space, which was suddenly created by the internet. So so therefore, in the history, then we've been thinking about the government, put the government as one of the stakeholder, which is basically the design of the ICANN when we started the ICANN, and then so one of course certainly the one of the stakeholder, but then the government, and then the industry, and especially the operators, and how the internet being operated and provided this global space has been considered very important. Now, because of the big change that everybody, the ISOC, Internet Society, has been saying that the internet is for everyone, and it's now for everyone, and everything, and so after the 30 years of the process, and then it's been kind of achieved, and then after that, then it's a matters of entire citizen, and then therefore the citizens and the people has to be protected by the government. So now government concerns about the internet space. Maybe it happened after the year 2000, 2001, especially when the 9/11 happened in United States, and then so the government now started to think in two ways: the security issues and also the economic issues. So then government both those are the two subjects: national security and then the economy. That's very much of a government concerns, and therefore they started to care. So how the question has been how we can kind of co-working together. This is different from the original position of the government and the internet, and so that's what I was talking about. Then so basically, very simple statement about this relationship is that each of the nation states should be kind of responsible on a kind of safe and trusted, and that they the internet space, cyberspace, including the data architecture, transparency, interoperability, and other things. And then that's a government responsibility, and then also the international relationship among the government should be kind of explicitly discussing about that, exchanging the wisdom. And I think that it has been happening in many places: G7, G20, OECD. So yeah, that's what I was talking about. So the change of the role of the government is recognized, and then so should be recognized, and then should be working individually by the government, but also the relationship and among the government as well.
Thank you very much, Jun. I'm sure that everybody in the audience feels the same kind of frustration that I have to be obliged to cut the segments in order to keep all the discussions in the time frame. Thank you very much for your comments. This will basically close the segment on data. We will launch the poll question for the next segment on content. And while you are feeding or filling this poll question, if you can launch the poll question, the third one. I will be making one comment regarding the discussion in the chat. Can you launch the poll? Yes. No, that was the first poll. Would like the next one, which asks there is enough international cooperation between the different stakeholders to address abuses online. Same as before: strongly disagree, disagree, neither agree, no disagree, agree, or strongly agree. I will take the 2 minutes for while you fill the poll to make a remark remarks that come from the chat. One, there was a very interesting comment, I think it was from Vittorio Bertola, regarding the notion that the data protection or the protection of individual individual personal data protection is actually an element of individual self-determination. And I know that there was a very interesting panel organized by the Swiss authorities 1 or 2 days ago on this topic. There was another comment, I don't remember who that was, who made the highlighted the importance of the distinction between different types of data. When we talk about data and data sovereignty, we tend to think mostly about personal data and the protections that are attached to it. But there are many other elements that are related to other types of data, industrial data in particular. And a final comment that I want to pick from the chat was from Henriette Sterisen, who didn't formulate it exactly this way, but basically indicates that there is restrictions, or there are restrictions by governments, but there are also elements of control by a certain number of companies regarding the data that they are storing, and that could have a public benefit as well. I think it's something that Alison was alluding to as well. So if we can see the results, here again, we have basically 70+% of people who feel that there is not enough international cooperation between the different stakeholders, a little bit less than the strong messages that we had in the previous one. But I think it is a message that resonates with the statistics I was quoting at the beginning, which is the lack of sufficient cooperation and coordination among all the stakeholders on cross-border legal issues. So I want to go to the section 2 and saying that, yes, there is a lot of discussions about disinformation and election interference, but there are many other forms of online abuses, and it's a common challenge for all the different actors to address those abuses. I just wanted to highlight a paradox, though, which is that the actual amount, the proportion of abusive content on the major platforms is, in relative terms, very small. It's less than 0.1% of the enormous amount of posts that are being posted. Yet at the same time, because of this enormous volume, the absolute numbers are staggering nonetheless. Hundreds of millions of posts that have to be taken down by a single major platform such as Facebook per year. So there is a paradox between the high visibility, the low proportionate number, and at the same time, the huge amount. And as I said before, the challenge is who sets the rules, who implements them, and who enforces them. So there are many trends, and I would like to go to Alison on the fundamental question, which is how to enable the coexistence in shared online spaces of billions of people who have very different perspectives, values, legal systems that they belong to. And Africa is a region that has also a lot of ethnic differences, religious, political, potential tensions. How do you see the debate going in Africa on those issues? Is there a continental discussion on expression and addressing abuses? And what role do the major platforms play today in a certain way in harmonizing the rules that apply around the world?
So thank you, Bertrand. I think, this goes to the fundamental changes that we see in communications and the globalization of communications, that also is no longer just, about content regulation that can be managed at the domestic level. we've had traditions of ombudsman and complaint systems and even positive regulation around quotas and stuff, language quotas, etc., to try and build the public space and the polity. We're now dealing with something that is, entirely has ruptured these traditional things, and of course, importantly, the normative underpinnings of these systems. So we now have really competing normative systems that make the implementation of consensus frameworks or even conventions at the regional level and at the global level very problematic. So we've had a number of initiatives from the African Union Commission who have had a Internet Rights Charter, that have had the Malabo Convention on Cybersecurity and Data Protection. And these are all wonderfully aligned with global conventions and standards and treaties. But in fact, their adoption at the national level is absolutely minimal. So I think the Malabo Convention has now gone up from 5 to 12 or something. It's extremely low. So countries are, even when it's passed, they're signing to the resolution, but they're not acceding to it. They're not actually implementing it at the national level. And the problem is that very many of these conventions, or globally, the aligned conventions around freedom of expression, data protection, these are still based on human rights, Universal Declaration of Rights, rule of law, things that are in fact not practiced in some of the jurisdictions that are resisting this. So although they want digital growth, they want the participation in the Continental Free Trade Agreement through digital participation and data flows and sharings of goods, they're still controlling certain or not acceding to certain of the rights frameworks, etc. So it makes the management of the global platforms, of course, all the more complicated. If things aren't even being, coordinated or harmonized at a regional level, the difficulties of doing this at the international level. But it's at the international level where it's happening. And I just wanted to say that in terms of the controlling of content and diversity and things, it's precisely these frameworks that are meant to manage and regulate and govern diversity, ethnicity. These things are not, inherently don't inherently create tensions. They create tensions through the manipulation of them and the lack of management of them, etc. Freedom of expression, etc. When it's suppressed, is that we get, responses to that. So I think it's very difficult to speak about the African region because, as I said, it's very diverse. Some countries have very strong constitutions that protect these rights and these frameworks that have very strong content and protection, anti-hate speech legislation, etc. But then, of course, there are very many others that don't. And again, it brings me to the point of global cooperation to manage these processes, particularly because the manifestation might be in the content, but a lot of the manipulation might be happening at the data governance level, at the data level, at the data governance level, as we saw with Cambridge Analytica. And so the importance of these information regulators that are emerging across the continent, I think, is a very positive sign, so that we actually do have data protection cases, things in place. We do have frameworks for cross-border flows. We do have frameworks for takedown of content that is harmful, and we are able to mitigate risks through data protection mechanisms, cybersecurity mechanisms, etc.
Do you think, Alison, thank you, and sorry for pressing the time, but do you think that African actors, and I not only mean governments, but also private sector and others, are sufficiently integrated in the global discussion and the global regulation regarding platforms? And, there's the Digital Services Act, there's a modification of the Section 230. These decisions will have an impact on all the users of those platforms internationally, as Paul was mentioning, the decisions by some actors to apply the same regulation worldwide. In just a couple of words, do you think that there is enough participation, and how could this be improved?
So absolutely there isn't. I think, we've done our own research on multi-stakeholder participation in things like IGF, even for, as we're here, but even in other forums, there not only are Africans not involved in many of these negotiations, and as I said, it's really important that they're not siloed into just the trade negotiations or the e-commerce negotiations or the taxation negotiations, because precisely if we get it, the digital taxation right, that could actually address a lot of the public interest governance that we need at the national level. So it's really important that we engage in these debates. Half of the countries stand outside of them because they simply are not kind of confronted with the development of their economies in that way. Others are actually resisting it. But we not only have to kind of be responsive to it, we have to actually begin to set the agendas from an African perspective so that it's really reflecting our interests. And we're not simply adopting conventions that are based on assumptions, interests, normative things from other areas, but actually reflect the interests of our own citizens, firms, nations in these debates.
Thank you. Well, hearing the notion of bridging silos is music to my ears, as you know. So I couldn't resist picking on it. I'm failing to a certain extent because we are pretty short on time. So I would like to just give the floor now to Rudolf Bridel for just a couple of minutes, if you can be very concise. Germany has been a pioneer on some elements regarding content moderation and regulation of platforms through the NetzDG that has been sometimes controversial as well. Europe is preparing the Digital Services Act. Can you say just a couple of words on what is the timeline for the Digital Services Act that will apply regulation and revise the e-commerce directive? And particularly, how much does it take into account in your expectation a differentiation according to of responsibilities according to the different types of actors? Just in a few words, if you can.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. Can you hear me and see me? Because yes. I can't see me. Okay. It says that the moderator asked me to do something. Okay. So the Digital Services Act, at the beginning, when we were planning for our EU presidency, we thought that we would be already dealing with the Digital Services Act during our presidency. Now, we will have probably the formal proposal by the Commission towards the end of the year. So it will probably be the Portuguese presidency that will be dealing in the Council with the Digital Services Act. So we will have to wait for another two or 3 weeks for the proposal to be on the table, and then we will have a full-fledged discussion in the Council probably in the first half of next year and beyond. That was for this question. Now for the German way, the NetzDG that you not mentioned explicitly, but you said you were at the forefront. Our NetzDG that imposes some obligations on the platform operators concerning hate speech and other criminal acts. That has been in place now for 3 years, more than 3 years, and we have made some very good experiences, namely that the most feared thing did not happen. There was no over-blocking. There was no over-obligation by the by the platform operators when applying this law. So we think that it could be a good basis for what we will have to discuss within the Digital Services Act. Because on the one hand, we need to somehow implicate the platforms. We do not want to give them the role of legislators or executive branch. On the other hand, we cannot operate without the platform operators. And we think that the solution we found in the NetzDG is a quite balanced one. And this evaluation that we did, that was written in the law, and it came out in autumn 6 or 8 weeks ago, said very clearly that it is working. And I do not have so much time, otherwise I would probably explain to you that it is not something. There are no new obligations or no new appreciations that we do impose on the network operators, but all is based on the existing panel codes. So there are no new panel codes or no new criminal powers giving to the criminal investigation powers giving to the platforms. It is on the basis of the existing law. I leave it by that because we do not have so much time. But if there are any questions, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodolphe. But I think the SDG is an example that shows that there are many lessons that can be drawn from the actual implementation of some of those rules. I'm very conscious of the time. I want to give the floor, and apologies to Paul Mitchell. I was intending to ask a question regarding the geographic scope of content restrictions, which is a very important issue, and Microsoft has been exposed to that through the right to be de-indexed. But I would be remiss if I didn't give the floor to a discussion that has been added to the panel. And I apologize in advance for the length. Alexei Goreslavsky, sorry, is coming from Russia. He has been in the administration, in the governmental side. He's now the head of an NGO. I would like to ask you, Alexei, one which was alluded to by Alison. It's the fact that a decision that is taken in one dimension can have consequence in another dimension. In particular, there is one of the countries that has data localization laws for the personal data. And there was a consequence, which is that because some companies didn't localize their data in accordance to that law, their access to the content of those companies was blocked in Russia. That is the case at the moment for LinkedIn. And I understand that it could potentially apply to other platforms that wouldn't do the same. Can you elaborate, and very briefly, if possible, on one, the rationale for the data localization laws, and how you see this constraint of one issue, which is privacy protection, impacting actually content accessibility?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Monsieur de la Chapelle, for this possibility to answer. I have some words in Russian for what we are doing here for trust. But following your question and following the discussion and the comments in chat, which is really very interesting, I would like to, first of all, to support the colleagues that trust can be achieved in the sphere of the internet governance only in digital cooperation, only on the unified platform, on unified approaches. As for your question for some blocked services in Russia, as I know, there is only one, that LinkedIn is, which is blocked in Russia on the basis of data mismanagement. As you know, in Russia we have some law which is all about data localization. So LinkedIn is not in order with Russian law of data management. This is only one reason why LinkedIn is blocked here. All others are still arguing with Russian authorities. So what I can briefly, 2 minutes in Russian, what I can say for you about trust in Russia and what we are doing here. Let me speak in 2 minutes in Russian. Начну с главного. В России цифровизация и предоставление равного доступа к государственным и другим услугам является одним из основных приоритетов развития. Уже достигнут определенный уровень доверия и дигитализации. Российские государственные услуги в электронном виде являются весьма популярными. Большинство населения находится в них. К 2024 году в России уже не останется документов на бумажных носителях. кроме удостоверения личности гражданина. Уже сейчас половина услуг государственных осуществляется онлайн. С точки зрения доверия государство серьезно инвестирует. Translation is not. Sorry. So let me switch in English and be very briefly 2 minutes, 1 minute. So in terms of investment of Russian government in trust, we have a large, huge system of incident management here in Russia, which is installed 2 years, has been installed for 2 years. It is ready to hear all comments from social networks from Russian citizens. If you have something broken or you will find something wrong on the street, you can simply write it down on the Facebook or Vkontakte or Одноклассники or in any social message, and we can organize a very quick and proper answer from authority who is responsible for that. So from now on, we have about 200,000 comments in a month on real cases. People from all our country can simply address to authorities and have a brief solution for the problem. That was very useful this year because of COVID-19. This direct communication was very useful for in fighting the fake news and fighting all rumors who distributed all around the country. You know, it was the same rumors that in all the world. It's all about 5G and so on and so on. We organized a very huge system of brief answer from authorities. So that's why the direct messaging from governors of leaders of Russian regions, which are 78 from 85, they are public. They are all on internet, and this year many of them started live video every month, every week, every day, answering all the questions the people had. My message was that we invest very we invest much in trust. So that's why we find all around us the situation that people are not ready for such a quick digitalization. So the question that we have, should we organize something about index of communication trust for all countries, which could be described on a unified basis? And should be on a unified platform. That could be a solution. Sorry, I probably didn't answer your question properly, but sorry for this cases in translation.
No, you're welcome, and thank you very much for having made the effort to switch to English for the sake of time. Two quick elements, and thank you again for having been there. One is what you were alluding to regarding the cooperation or the tools to be able to identify abuses and so on is a very large issue, and it is one component in the cooperation between the different actors and the question of the distribution of the roles. There are different perspectives on this, the respective roles of the actors, but the way different stakeholder groups can address the common issue, which is addressing abuses, is something that requires specific frameworks. Whether they are universal frameworks or more smaller frameworks depends also on the willingness and the convergence between the different actors. But I want to finish with one element. I asked you about the unintended consequence of a decision of data localization in Russia on the blocking of a platform. In a certain way, there are also unintended consequences of the GDPR, which leads to a certain number of services in the US not serving Europe because they are not interested in the European citizens and they don't want to abide by the GDPR. So the notion of unintended consequences and the notion of connection between different fields and silos is something that, as Alison said, needs to be handled by bridging the different silos. Otherwise, you make a decision on one domain and the impact is actually on another domain. Thank you very much. I have to finalize this panel. I've been told that we have a few minutes of of authorization afterwards. Can we have the last poll? And I will move directly to yes. So you see, digital policies should respect the technical architecture of the internet. Strongly disagree, disagree, neither agree or disagree, agree, or strongly agree. And I would like to maybe move while you're speaking on or filling the poll. Sorry, I would like to ask Atsuko maybe to rapidly, because of the time, answer the following question. There is a distinction between the fragmentation debate on the existing internet and another question, which is the notion of what has been introduced in particular in the ITU on behalf of China and Huawei on the notion of new IP. I know that the Secretariat cannot take sides of an international organization, but how do you handle what is the current status of the discussion? Because it's a very polarizing issue. And the notion of new IP, how do the different countries in the ITU address this topic? And is there a danger in that? I mean, in the splitting of the community, not in the topic itself, which I know you cannot take a position on.
Thank you. It's a very important question. And this is also linked to the poll number 2, the insufficient international cooperation. Now, as we discussed, I did a bit of a consultation with colleagues in HQ. This proposal, a new IP shaping future network, was presented by China Mobile, China Unicom, and Huawei to the rapporteur group on standardization strategy in September 2019. So basically, this is dealt with as part of the standardization question. And there were certain activities which happened related to this proposal. And eventually, there was a joint liaison statement issued to all study groups. As you know, in ITU, we have a number of different study groups looking at this interface between technology and infrastructure and policy. So it was presented to the study groups for future action. But I believe that at the moment, what happened is that this joint liaison statement was issued, and this is where we are at the moment. But can I also share with you that this data localization and data sovereignty issue is not only related to the new IP, but there are different study groups which are addressing bits and pieces of the topic, such as standardization study group 13 on future networks, including cloud computing, and 17, which is about confidence and security in the use of ICT, and study group 20, IoT and smart cities.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would like to recommend is that we don't have time to go into the nitty-gritty of what these study groups came up with, but there is a space internationally to share your views and the research and the policy positions in the space of ITU. And I would like to recommend the participants and interested parties to come and join and discuss to establish the international norms or principles that we thought many participants thought lacking at this stage. So I want to give the floor back to you, Bertrand.
Thank you very much, Natsuko. This is clearly a topic that I didn't want to let out of the space, and it's important to follow it. And I will actually move and ask Alisa maybe briefly to make a few comments in that regard. In particular, because in the prep call, you mentioned that when you hear this debate about the new IP, it reminds you of some of the challenges that you were confronted with, or what the community is confronted with, from the shift from IPv4 to IPv6, and that the shift from one protocol to another is a very big endeavor that has to be something that is really needed to happen. Can you elaborate briefly on that?
Yeah, happy to. So I think
you're muted.
Oh, am I? You can't hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, I look unmuted on my side. Okay.
So worked so far. Can we make sure that Alisa is unmuted?
Looks like some people can hear me and some people cannot hear me.
We can hear her.
We can hear her.
Okay. Okay, well, I'm gonna.
I can't.
Huh. Strange.
Does everybody hear?
The panelists can't hear.
No,
but
I can't.
The attendees can hear.
That's interesting. If some people can hear and others not, that's a fragmentation.
We can hear.
Okay, it might just be Bertrand who can't hear, maybe. Well, perhaps I can give remarks to the people who can hear, and we can go from there. So, so I think IP is one of the places where we really do not want to see any further fragmentation. There's a small set of core infrastructure that maintains the global unity of the internet, and the IP addressing space is one of those. The global domain name system is another. And so we really need that harmonization at the IP layer to allow for data and connectivity to be seamless around the globe. And so when the arguments, the motivation to create something which is non-interoperable with IP and sort of throw away the investment that we've had in connecting billions of devices to the IP network would have to be, I think, overwhelming in order to justify that level of investment. And when we look at the existing new IP proposals in the ITUT, we don't really see that justification. A lot of the challenges that are used to motivate the proposals are actually being actively worked on or have already been addressed with existing standards and technologies. And so from our perspective, it's not a justified new additional fragmentation. And as Bertrand mentioned, we have some worked experience with this in the tremendous effort over the decades to deploy IPv6, which has a similar lack of compatibility. And we think the efforts of the global engineering community are best put into the continuing advancement of IPv6 and the seamless interoperability between IPv4 and IPv6, as opposed to developing yet another non-interoperable IP technology.
Thank you very much, Alisa. Do people hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Because apparently I am the one having a problem of receiving the audio. Fortunately, there was the captioning for a moment so I could follow your comments, Alisa. And it was very important to see the question of the barrier and the justification for the investment and the shift from one system to another. I want to be very respectful for the people who may have a session afterwards, and also for the tech team. So I intended, apologies to June and to others, I wanted to ask June one question regarding the notion of an impact assessment, whether it is appropriate for states and for all actors to have an impact assessment evaluation of what are the consequences of their decisions on other countries, on different other segments of society. When you do something for privacy protection or human rights protection, does it have an impact on economy? Vice versa, when you do something for security, does it have an impact on human rights? So this notion of an impact assessment would have been an additional important notion in the context of responsible behavior by all different actors. In closing, I want to say that I've been absolutely thrilled by the thing, and thank you for showing the result of the poll, which I think was taken before the comments, but there is a strong agreement of 76% of people regarding the respecting of the technical architecture. And I think the general idea here is the interfacing between the communities of the policy people and the technical people needs to be strengthened, because at the moment, there probably are not enough spaces where those actors can see the interfacing eye to eye. I was thrilled by some of the exchanges in the chat. So I want to reiterate that we will try to integrate this in the discussion. In closing, I want to say two things. One, as I was mentioning the notion of impact assessment, without being too pedantic, those of you who are familiar with philosophy know that Immanuel Kant used the concept of categoric imperative, which is basically, when it is applied to policy, whenever an entity, government or private sector or other civil society, considers a particular measure, try to think about the question, would I wish that everybody else implements the same thing? If the answer is yes, then it is likely to be a good measure. If on the other hand, you say, well, I would like to do it because it benefits me, but I wouldn't like everybody else to do it, maybe it's worth thinking twice, just as a suggestion. And the second point is that I hope that after this session, when you will hear the word digital sovereignty, you will understand it the way I hope it permeated in the discussion as how is sovereignty exercised in the digital age? Because it is a big discussion. It is a major challenge. It may be a paradigm shift because it includes notions like extraterritoriality that we didn't have the opportunity to explore in great detail. But what is important is that it can be addressed only through cooperation and dialogue between the different actors, because otherwise we will have unilateral decisions and a legal arms race that actually in the end is detrimental for everyone. And I want to finish with quotes. The first one is from Vint Cerf that I was happy to see was in the audience today. He basically said that managing the way separate legal frameworks apply to the internet is actually more complex than inventing it. And that was a comment he made at one of the global conferences that we organized in Paris. Another quote is that Kofi Annan, back in 2004, said, in developing internet governance, I paraphrase, we need to be as creative as those who invented it. And the final one, and the final word for this, is a quote from Elinor Ostrom, former Nobel Prize in Economics, And this quote was on the wall of one of the rooms of the venue in Berlin, where we organized the third global conference of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. And it is: a core goal of public policy should be to facilitate the development of institutions that bring out the best in humans. With that, I wish you an excellent follow-up. I thank all the panelists. Congratulate the attendees for the great discussions in the chat. Thank you for the tech team and to the MAG and its chair who organized and helped me prepare this session. Have a great day and good luck in the other sessions of the IGF this week.
Thank you very much, sir. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.